letter to the Romans, chapter 8, is excellent in terms of understanding suffering. So I'd like to look at just the first reading, St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8. When we're going through suffering in our lives, it can overwhelm us. We can be so focused on it in terms of maybe complaining, or it will just completely dominate our whole lives, where it's the only thing that we think about all the time. All the other good things in our life just sort of go right by us. We don't even notice them. We stop noticing because the suffering or the challenge that we're going through at that time, it's just so overwhelming. And when we hear in the middle of this passage, this great metaphor, this illustration of the whole of creation is groaning in labor pains, this image of labor pains, and we too groan inwardly, waiting for redemption in our bodies. And this complaining when we're going through suffering or witnessing suffering is like those labor pains, like those inward groanings. And when we take a look at, or just zoom in for a moment on that experience of labor pains and those groanings, it's a horrendous experience in those hours of delivering a baby. In a way, that's sort of our experience with suffering. It's just so overwhelming that nothing else matters. St. Paul, though, this whole passage is about hope. When we look at our first phrase from it, St. Paul says, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory about to be revealed for us." All the sufferings in this world aren't even close in terms of being on the same level as the glory that we are about to experience in heaven. It's at a whole other level. And so he's giving us that hope that we should look forward to heaven with such anticipation that this suffering is just a small glimpse of our lifetime. Yet we have this beauty of heaven that awaits us, that has been prepared for us, that is our destiny, that is what we were made for. Now, what's interesting too is that he says we know that the whole of creation has been groaning in labor pains. All of creation. We may wonder, what does that mean? Well, this all ties back to Genesis. It all ties back to the book of Genesis. As soon as sin entered the world, what did God say to Adam and Eve? He told Adam that you will only survive by the sweat of your brow. It's going to be tough. Life is going to be hard for you to make a living and to survive. And what did he say to Eve? That there will be labor pains. There will be great pains in childbirth. That's where this comes from. It comes from sin. Suffering comes from sin. It's a consequence of sin. So to say that all of creation experiences these labor pains, we may wonder, what does that mean? How is that even possible? Well, we don't need to look far. When we look at the sin of humanity, of society, of the world, in terms of greed, in terms of exploitation of resources, in terms of the inequity of distribution of resources, we have these situations of drought and famine and horrible experiences that all of creation, the whole world is now corrupted because of humanity's sinfulness and our poor choices. So all of creation now joins individually with us. So individually we have those groans, those inward groans, those labor pains, because we are suffering thanks to sin in our world. But what Paul is saying is that all of creation joins with us in those labor pains, in those inward groanings, waiting for what we were made to be, waiting for the redemption and restoration of the world, of all of humanity. And where does that restoration take place? It takes place on the cross. Jesus is the new Adam. He is the new Adam. The first Adam brought sin into the world through his choice. The new Adam, who is Jesus, brings restoration and redemption to all of humanity and even the whole world. That is the hope that we get to look forward to. And as Paul finishes up, when he wraps up here in this bottom part of 8th chapter of Romans from today's first reading, it says, "We now hope that is seen is not hope, but if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. So what he's saying is, don't put our trust, don't put our hope in the created world. Don't put our hope in created things. Don't put our hope in things in this world, maybe power, wealth, money, whatever it may be. Don't put your hope in that. Don't put your hope in that. He's saying, hope for what you do not see, and then wait for it with patience. We do not see heaven. Wait for it with patience, because that is something to hope for, and that is something that is not even worth comparing to our sufferings, because the glory of heaven is going to be so great. And again, just to tie that in with our labor pains metaphor and image, a mother does not know what her son or daughter will look like in those 9 months that she's waiting and pregnant, right? But she does have a hope for something that she has not yet seen. She has a hope for something she has not yet seen. And again, she waits with patience. Notice Paul is talking about patience for our life, but again, a mother is the same thing. She waits for it in patience. And sure enough, and I've spoken to some women about this, especially after this morning's Mass, but also talking to my mom, I said, Mom, after you went through those hours of labor, brutal experience, was it worth it in the end? And she says, of course it was worth it. I've had years and decades of joy that you've brought to my life. And isn't that true for a parent, especially for a mother who's, those 9 months, difficult morning sickness and all the rest of it. That challenging experience, and then the culmination of that suffering, we could say, in terms of the pains of giving birth. Sure enough, as soon as the child is received into the mother's arms, from that moment on, there's tremendous joy. And again, she waited in patience for something that was not seen. And so Paul reminds us that this is a great example, a great image for us to keep in mind in terms of our lives. We are made for heaven. We have not seen heaven yet, but we need to wait for it in patience. And that while we may be going through difficulties and sufferings in our lives, none of them compare. It's not even close to the glory that awaits us in heaven.